The emergency room doors exploded open with a metallic crash that echoed down the sterile hallway. Two military police officers moved fast, flanking a stretcher that was already trailing crimson across the white tile floor. The paramedic at the head of the gurney was shouting medical terminology that most of the night shift staff couldn't fully decode, but everyone understood the tone. This was bad. This was the kind of bad that ended careers or lives, depending on who made the wrong call in the next 10 minutes. And right behind them, moving with the rigid, controlled fury of a man who had commanded thousands in combat, came a three-star general in full dress uniform, his jaw locked, his eyes scanning the room like he was preparing to invade it. He stopped just inside the automatic doors, planted his feet, and spoke in a voice that made the fluorescent lights seem to dim. "Want your top surgeon right now, not the resident on call, not whoever is available, your absolute best. Do you understand me?" The charge nurse, a 20-year veteran who had seen every kind of chaos this hospital could produce, opened her mouth to answer. But before she could, the general's aide stepped forward, a young captain with a tablet and a face drained of color. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice cracking just slightly, "they said she's already here, she's coming." The general's eyes narrowed. "Then where the hell is she?" And that's when the back hallway door opened, and a woman in wrinkled scrubs, no makeup, her dark hair pulled into a hasty bun, walked into the room with the calm, unhurried stride of someone who had seen worse and survived it. She didn't salute, she didn't introduce herself. She just looked at the patient, looked at the general, and said, "I'll take it from here." And for the first time in 30 years of military service, the general froze. Pause. Let's rewind. Because what happened in that emergency room wasn't random. It wasn't luck. And it definitely wasn't what anyone in that building expected. To understand how a single moment could stop a three-star general in his tracks, you have to understand who Dr. Alina Marks was, and more importantly, who everyone thought she wasn't. St. Augustine Medical Center sat on the edge of a mid-sized American city that was equal parts college town, military base, and blue-collar heartland. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, where your last name mattered more than your resume, and where the old guard still held every key to every door that mattered. The hospital itself was a sprawling complex of glass and brick that had been renovated 3 times in the last decade, funded largely by donations from the families who ran the local businesses, the car dealerships, the construction firms, the law offices. Their names were etched into plaques in every wing, and the culture inside reflected that. If you came from the right family, you were given the benefit of the doubt. If you didn't, you had to prove yourself twice as hard and 3 times as long. Dr. Alina Marks had been on staff for 8 months. She was a general surgeon, board certified, with a residency completed at a respected but not famous program in the Midwest. Her references were solid. Her skills were excellent. But she was quiet. She didn't go to the donor galas. She didn't play golf with the hospital board. She didn't laugh at the chief of surgery's jokes in the conference room, and she didn't perform the small rituals of deference that greased the wheels of institutional favor. She just worked. Long shifts, double shifts, weekend coverage. She took the cases no one else wanted, the messy ones, the uncertain ones, the patients without insurance or family or anyone to advocate for them. And because she didn't perform the social dance, she became invisible, not incompetent, just unremarkable. Forgettable, the kind of doctor who was useful but never celebrated. Her direct supervisor was Dr. Warren Calloway, the chief of general surgery, and a man whose ego was as carefully maintained as his salt and pepper hair and his collection of Italian ties. Calloway had been at St. Augustine for nearly 20 years. He had delivered the children of city council members. He had operated on the uncle of a state senator. He was beloved in the way that powerful men who know how to smile at the right moments are beloved, but he was also lazy. He delegated the hard cases. He took credit for outcomes he had only supervised from a distance, and he had a particular disdain for anyone who didn't come from his world. Women, especially women who didn't flatter him, were either patronized or ignored. Dr. Marks fell into the latter category. He mispronounced her first name in meetings. He assigned her the graveyard shifts and the overflow traumas. He never once asked her where she had trained before her residency, or why she had come to this particular hospital in this particular town. If he had, he mig. T.have learned something that would have changed the way he spoke to her. But he didn't ask, and she didn't volunteer. There were others on staff who noticed her, though. Noticed the way her hands never shook during a procedure. Noticed that she could close a wound faster and cleaner than surgeons with twice her experience. Noticed that she stayed late to check on post-op patients no one else remembered. One of those people was Jenna Ruiz, a surgical nurse in her early 30s who had worked at St. Augustine long enough to know which doctors were worth respecting and which ones were just good at performing respect. Jenna liked Dr. Marks. She didn't know why the surgeon was so quiet, or why she seemed to carry herself with a kind of restraint that felt almost military, but she trusted her. And on the night everything changed, that trust would matter more than anyone could have predicted. Pause. It was a Thursday in late September. The kind of night where the emergency department was busy but not overwhelmed. Car accidents from the rain, a kitchen burn, a college kid with alcohol poisoning, routine chaos. Dr. Marks was finishing a chart in the surgical wing when her pager went off. Trauma incoming. High priority. She moved quickly but didn't run. She never ran. By the time she reached the trauma bay, the double doors were already swinging open and the noise level had spiked. 2 MPs, a paramedic, a stretcher. A man in his mid-20s, unconscious, his uniform soaked in blood, an improvised pressure bandage across his abdomen that was already failing. And behind him, a wall of authority in the form of a general whose presence made the air in the room feel heavier. The charge nurse gave the report in clipped sentences. Motor vehicle accident. Rollover. Penetrating abdominal trauma, possible liver laceration, possible internal bleeding, blood pressure dropping, pulse thready. The patient was a Marine stationed at the nearby base, and the general, his name was Harding and his chest was covered in ribbons that represented 3 decades of service, was his commanding officer. Harding didn't wait for permission to speak. "I want the best you have," he said, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos. "This Marine has served 2 combat tours. He has a wife and a daughter. I want your top surgeon on this case right now, or I will have someone flown in from Walter Reed. Do I make myself clear?" Dr. Calloway wasn't on site. He was at a dinner event downtown, representing the hospital at some kind of fundraiser. The senior resident stammered something about protocol, about availability, about trying to reach the attending on call. And then Dr. Marks stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. She just said, "I'm the attending on trauma call tonight. I'll take him." The general's eyes locked on her. She was maybe 5'6". Her scrubs were wrinkled. She looked young, younger than she was, and she had none of the performative confidence that Calloway always projected. For a long, silent moment, Harding just stared at her. And then he said, "You." It wasn't quite disbelief, but it wasn't confidence either. Pause. Dr. Marks didn't flinch. She had heard that tone before. She had heard it in 100 different rooms from 100 different men who had looked at her and decided she couldn't possibly be what she claimed to be. She had stopped explaining herself a long time ago. "Yes, sir," she said. "I'm the trauma surgeon on call. If you want your Marine to survive the next hour, I need to get him into an OR right now. You can stay here or you can wait upstairs." "But you can't be in my operating room." Harding's jaw tightened. He looked at the nurse. He looked at the resident, and then slowly he nodded. "Save him," he said, "or I will hold every person in this building accountable." And then he stepped back. Dr. Marks moved. She moved like someone who had trained for this exact scenario 1,000 times, which she had. She gave orders in a low, calm voice: blood products, anesthesia, or 2, prep now. Jenna Ruiz, who had just arrived for her shift, heard the call and jogged into the bay. When she saw Dr. Marks already gowning up, she felt a wave of relief. If this Marine had a chance, it was because Marks was the one taking him in. They rolled the patient into the operating room. The anesthesiologist, a man named Dr. Patel, who was one of the few people who openly respected Marks, worked quickly to stabilize vitals while the surgical team prepped. The patient was crashing. Blood pressure was dropping. Time was running out. And in the hallway outside, General Harding stood with his back against the wall, his hands clasped behind him, his eyes closed, waiting. Pause. The surgery took 4 hours, 4 hours of meticulous, relentless focus. The liver laceration was worse than the initial scans had suggested. There was a torn mesenteric vessel, a hematoma pressing on the inferior vena cava. A lesser surgeon might have lost him in the first 30 minutes, but Dr. Marks didn't lose him. She worked with the precision of someone who had been trained not just in surgical technique, but in battlefield decision-making. Every choice was calculated. Every movement was economical. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation, no ego. Jenna watched her work and felt something close to awe. She had been in a lot of operating rooms. She had seen a lot of surgeons, but she had never seen anyone move like this. It was like watching a musician who had practiced a piece so many times that it had become muscle memory, except the stakes were infinitely higher. At one point, Dr. Patel looked up from his monitors and said quietly, "You're going to get him through this." Dr. Marks didn't answer. She just kept working. When the bleeding was finally controlled, when the vessels were repaired, when the abdomen was irrigated and closed, she stepped back, pulled off her gloves, and let out a slow breath. "He's stable," she said. "Post-op ICU, Close monitoring for the next 48 hours, but he'll live. The room erupted in quiet, professional relief. Jenna squeezed her shoulder. Dr. Patel nodded, the kind of nod that meant respect. And Dr. Marks walked out of the OR, exhausted, her scrubs stained, her mind already running through the post-op checklist, and ran straight into the wall of bureaucracy and ego that was waiting for her in the hallway. Pause. Dr. Warren Calloway had arrived 20 minutes earlier, fresh from his donor dinner, his tie still perfectly knotted, his cologne filling the narrow hallway outside the surgical wing. He had been briefed by the charge nurse. He knew a general was in the building. He knew a high-profile case was in progress. And he knew, with the kind of instinct that comes from decades of institutional politics, that this was an opportunity. When Dr. Marks stepped out of the OR, Calloway was standing there with his arms crossed, his expression a carefully managed mix of concern and authority. "Dr. Marks," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "I need a full briefing, immediately." She blinked, still coming down from the adrenaline of the surgery. "The patient is stable. Post-op orders are already in the system. I'll have a full report by morning." Calloway's eyes narrowed. "That's not how this works. You don't take a case like this without clearing it with me first. Do you have any idea who that man is? Do you understand the stakes?" She stared at him. "He's a patient. The stakes were his life. I saved it." Calloway's face flushed. "You don't get to make that call. I am the chief of this department. I should have been notified. I should have been consulted." And then, before she could respond, he turned and walked toward the waiting area where General Harding was standing, his posture rigid, his face unreadable. Calloway extended his hand, his smile sharp and professional. "General Harding, I'm Dr. Warren Calloway, Chief of General Surgery. I want you to know that I personally oversaw this case. My team performed brilliantly, and I'm pleased to report that your Marine is going to make a full recovery." Harding didn't shake his hand, he just looked at him. "You oversaw it?" Calloway's smile faltered just slightly. "Yes, sir, I made sure the right people were in place, the right protocols followed." Harding's voice was quiet, but it cut like a blade. "I didn't see you in that operating room." Calloway opened his mouth, closed it, and then smoothly pivoted. "I was coordinating from the administrative side, ensuring resources, managing the team. That's what leadership is, general, delegation." Harding's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went cold. And Dr. Marks, standing 10 feet away, still in her surgical cap, still exhausted, felt the bitter, familiar taste of being erased. Pause. If you're feeling that anger right now, that sense of injustice, you're not alone. Stories like this matter because they remind us what integrity actually costs and how often it goes unrecognized. If this story is hitting you the way it's supposed to, do me a favor and hit that like button. It tells me you want more of these, and honestly, it helps me keep making them. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. We tell real feeling stories about people who do the right thing even when no one's watching. You won't regret it. The next 48 hours should have been a victory lap. The Marine, whose name was Corporal Dennison, was recovering faster than anyone expected. His vitals were strong. His wife, a young woman with red-rimmed eyes and a toddler clinging to her leg, sat by his bedside and whispered thank yous to every nurse who entered the room. General Harding visited twice a day, standing at the foot of the bed with his hands behind his back, his face carved from stone, saying very little but observing everything. And Dr. Calloway made sure he was visible. He spoke to the family. He spoke to the Jenner. He walked the halls with a clipboard and an air of command, making sure that everyone knew he was the man in charge, the man responsible for the outcome. Dr. Marks, meanwhile, returned to her regular schedule. She checked on Corporal Dennison during her rounds, reviewed his labs, adjusted his medications, and moved on. She didn't linger. She didn't seek praise. She just worked. But the silence around her was louder than before. The other surgeons didn't congratulate her. The residents didn't ask her questions about the case. It was as if the surgery had never happened, or as if someone else had performed it. Jenna Ruiz noticed. She noticed the way Calloway's name was now attached to the case in every conversation. She noticed the way the hospital's public relations team was drafting a press release that mentioned our exceptional surgical leadership without naming Dr. Marks at all. And she noticed the way Dr. Marks seemed to shrink into herself, not with shame, but with the quiet exhaustion of someone who had fought this battle before and knew how it ended. On the third day after the surgery, Dr. Marks was called into Calloway's office. It was a corner office with a view of the parking lot and a wall covered in framed diplomas, certificates, and photos of Calloway shaking hands with politicians and donors. He was sitting behind his desk, his fingers steepled, his expression paternalistic. "Close the door," he said. She did. "I want to talk to you about protocol," he began. "You're a capable surgeon, Alina. No one is questioning that." But you have a problem with authority. You don't communicate. You don't collaborate. You took a high-profile case without consulting me, and that put this department at risk." She stood very still. There was no time to consult anyone. The patient was bleeding out. Calloway sighed, the kind of sigh that was meant to sound patient but came across as condescending. "That's not the point. The point is that you don't understand how things work here. This hospital runs on relationships, on trust, on teamwork, and you frankly don't seem interested in being part of the team." She didn't respond. He leaned forward. "I'm putting a note in your file. Consider this a formal warning. The next time you bypass protocol, there will be consequences. Do you understand?" She met his eyes. "I understand." And she walked out. Pause. Here's the thing about power. Real power isn't always loud. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it walks quietly, observes carefully, and waits for the right moment to act. And General Harding was a man who understood power better than almost anyone alive. He hadn't risen to 3 stars by being impulsive. He had learned over decades how to read a room, how to assess a situation, and how to detect when someone was lying to him. And from the moment Dr. Calloway had tried to take credit for saving Corporal Dennison, Harding had known something was wrong. He didn't confront it immediately. He watched. He asked questions. He spoke to the nurses quietly in the hallway. He spoke to Dr. Patel, the anesthesiologist, who had been in the OR and who didn't mince words. "If you want to know who saved your Marine," Patel said, "it was Dr. Marks, no one else, not even close." Harding filed that information away. And then he made a phone call. It was a short call, just a name, a request, and a confirmation. The person on the other end of the line said they'd look into it. And 3 days later, Harding received a file, a personnel file, a service record, a file that made him go very, very still as he read it. And when he was done reading, he closed the folder, set it on the table in front of him, and sat in silence for a long time. Then he stood up, put on his cover, and walked out of his temporary office on the base, heading back to the hospital. This time, he wasn't coming as a worried commanding officer. He was coming as someone who knew exactly what he was looking at, and he was not happy. Pause. It was early evening when General Harding returned to St. Augustine Medical Center. The lobby was quiet, the daylight fading through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the tile floor. He didn't check in at the front desk. He didn't announce himself. He simply walked through the building with the confidence of a man who had commanded troops in combat zones and who was not about to be stopped by hospital administration. He found Dr. Marks in the surgical wing, finishing her notes at a computer terminal in the hallway. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and for a moment something flickered across her face, not fear but recognition. The kind of recognition that comes from knowing you've been seen. Harding stopped a few feet away. "Dr. Marks," he said, "I'd like a word in private." She saved her chart, logged out, and stood. "Of course, sir." He led her to an empty consultation room, closed the door, and turned to face her. For a long moment he drew. St. looked at her, and then he said, "You didn't tell me who you were." She didn't look away. "You didn't ask, sir." Harding exhaled slowly. "I made some calls. I wanted to know who had saved one of my Marines. I wanted to understand why a surgeon I'd never heard of was able to do what you did in that operating room." He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket and set it on the table between them. It was a DD-214, a discharge document. And at the top, in clean military print, was her name. Captain Alina Marks, MD, United States Army, Combat Surgical Team, 2 deployments, Iraq and Afghanistan, honorable discharge, commendation for valor under fire. Harding's voice was quiet but edged with something that might have been anger, not at her, but at the situation. "You were a military surgeon. You operated in field hospitals under mortar fire. You saved soldiers when there was no backup, no equipment, no margin for error. And you came here to this place, and you let them treat you like you were nobody." Pause. Dr. Marks looked at the paper on the table. She didn't pick it up. "I didn't let them treat me anyway, sir. I just did my job." Harding shook his head. "That's not good enough. You have a chief of surgery out there taking credit for your work. You have a hospital that doesn't even know who you are. Why didn't you say something?" She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "Because it doesn't matter. I didn't come here to be celebrated. I came here to practice medicine. I came here because after 8 years in combat zones, I wanted to work somewhere quiet, somewhere normal. I wanted to save lives without wondering if the building I was in was about to be hit by a rocket. I didn't need anyone to know where I'd been. I just needed to work." Harding studied her. "And you thought they'd let you?" "I thought it didn't matter." He leaned back against the table, his arms crossed. "It matters, doctor. It matters because right now, the man who runs your department is telling people that he's the reason Corporal Dennison is alive. It matters because you're being punished for doing your job better than anyone else in this building could have done it. And it matters because if you don't speak up, no one else will." She met his eyes. "With respect, sir, I didn't ask you to fight this battle for me." Harding smiled just a little. It was the smile of a man who had heard that line before, usually right before he ignored it. "No, you didn't, but I'm going to anyway." Pause. What happened next unfolded with the precision of a military operation, because that's exactly what it was. General Harding didn't go to Dr. Calloway. He went over his head. He contacted the hospital's chief executive officer, a man named Thomas Brennan, who had spent 20 years in healthcare administration, and who understood very quickly that having a 3-star general make a formal complaint was not something you could smooth over with a press release. Brennan agreed to a meeting. Harding insisted it be held in a conference room with witnesses and that it be documented. He also insisted that Dr. Marks be present. Calloway was summoned. He arrived confident, his tie perfectly knotted, his smile in place. He thought he was being called in to discuss a commendation, maybe a public ceremony. He was wrong. The conference room was on the top floor of the administrative building, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a long table that could seat 20. Harding sat at the head of the table. Brennan sat to his right. A hospital attorney sat across from him, her laptop open, her expression neutral. Dr. Marks sat near the far end, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable. And when Calloway walked in, saw the setup, and realized this was not what he had expected, his smile faltered. Brennan gestured to a chair. "Dr. Calloway, please sit down." Calloway sat. He looked at Harding, looked at Marks, and then back at Brennan. "Is there a problem?" Harding didn't wait for Brennan to answer. "Yes," he said, "there's a problem. You lied to me." Pause. The room went very still. Calloway blinked. "I'm sorry." Harding's voice was calm, but there was no warmth in it. "3 nights ago, you told me that you personally oversaw the surgery that saved Corporal Dennison. You told me that you managed the team, ensured the outcome, and that the success of that operation was due to your leadership." Calloway straightened in his chair. "That's correct. You weren't in the building," Harding interrupted. "You weren't in the OR, you weren't even on call. You were at a fundraising dinner downtown, and you didn't arrive until after the surgery was finished." Calloway's face flushed. "I coordinated resources. You took credit for work you didn't do." Harding's tone didn't rise, but the weight of it pressed down on the room like a physical force. "The surgeon who saved my Marine was Dr. Alina Marks. She was the trauma attending on call. She performed a 4-hour exploratory laparotomy under conditions that would have overwhelmed most surgeons. She stabilized a patient who was actively dying, and you walked in after it was over and told me it was your success." Calloway looked at Brennan. "This is absurd. I'm the chief of surgery. Everything that happens in my department is my responsibility. That's how leadership works." Harding opened the folder in front of him and slid it across the table. "Then let me tell you who you were dismissing. Dr. Marks is a former Army captain. She served 2 combat deployments with a forward surgical team. She operated in field hospitals under enemy fire. She has been recommended for commendations by officers who watched her save lives when there was no backup, no advanced imaging, and no room for error. She is one of the most experienced trauma surgeons you have on staff, and you treated her like she was invisible." The attorney was typing quickly. Brennan's face had gone pale, and Calloway for the first time had no response. Harding leaned forward. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to issue a formal correction. You're going to make it clear in writing who performed that surgery. You're going to remove any disciplinary notation from Dr. Marks' file. And you're going to publicly acknowledge her work, not because I'm asking you to, because it's the truth." Calloway's jaw tightened. "You can't." "I can," Harding said. "And I will. Because if you don't, I will make sure that every medical board, every military liaison, and every accreditation body that oversees this hospital knows that you falsified credit for a life-saving surgery. Do you understand me?" The silence in the room was absolute. Pause. "If you've made it this far, I just want to say thank you. These stories take time to put together, and the fact that you're still here means something. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. We're building a community of people who believe that integrity matters, that competence should be recognized, and that sometimes the quiet ones are the ones who change everything. Hit that bell icon, too, so you don't miss the next one." Dr. Calloway left the meeting without another word. He walked out of the conference room, his face a mask of controlled fury, and within 48 hours he had submitted his resignation. The official reason given was personal circumstances, but everyone in the hospital knew what had really happened. The Whisper network moved fast. By the end of the week, the truth was out. Dr. Marks had been a military surgeon. She had saved Corporal Dennison. And Dr. Calloway had tried to take credit for her work and had been forced out when the lie was exposed. The hospital's public relations team drafted a new statement. This one named Dr. Alina Marks specifically, acknowledged her background, and praised her skill and dedication. It was posted on the hospital's website, shared by local news outlets, and picked up by a few military blogs. The comments section filled with messages from veterans, from former colleagues, from people who had served with her or been treated by her. They all said the same thing: she was the best. She was calm under fire. She saved lives when no one else could, and she never asked for recognition, but recognition came anyway. Pause. 2 weeks after the surgery, the hospital held a small, quiet ceremony in the main lobby. It wasn't a big event. No media, no politicians, just staff, a few patients, and General Harding, who had returned specifically for this moment. Dr. Marks was presented with a commendation from the hospital. Brennan, the CEO, read a brief statement acknowledging her service, both in the military and at St. Augustine, and thanking her for her dedication. And then General Harding stepped forward. He didn't read from a script, he just spoke. "Dr. Marks," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet lobby, "I've served with a lot of soldiers, I've seen a lot of courage, but what you did for Corporal Dennison and what you've done for countless others represents the best of what medicine and military service are supposed to be. You didn't do it for recognition, you didn't do it for rank or credit, you did it because it was your duty. And that is something I will never forget." He extended his hand, she shook it. And then, in a gesture that surprised everyone in the room, General Harding came to attention and saluted. It was a slow, deliberate salute, the kind given not out of protocol but out of respect. And Dr. Marks, after just a moment's hesitation, returned it. The room erupted in applause. Jenna Ruiz, standing near the back, was crying. Dr. Patel was clapping so hard his hands hurt. And Corporal Dennison, who had been discharged 2 days earlier but had come back for this moment, stood with his wife and his daughter and watched the woman who had saved his life finally receive the recognition she had never asked for. Pause. And the wait. Case that followed, things changed at St. Augustine Medical Center. Not overnight, not perfectly, but they changed. Dr. Marks was promoted to interim chief of general surgery while the hospital conducted a search for Calloway's permanent replacement. She didn't ask for the position, but when Brennan offered it, she accepted it with the same quiet professionalism she brought to everything else. She used her new authority carefully. She didn't fire people. She didn't grandstand. She just started rebuilding a culture of competence, accountability, and respect. She instituted peer reviews that were actually honest. She made sure that credit went to the people who did the work, not the people who had the best relationships with administration. And she made it clear in 100 small ways that at St. Augustine, your skills mattered more than your last name. The residents loved her. The nurses loved her. Even the older attendings, the ones who had been skeptical at first, came around when they saw that she wasn't interested in power for its own sake. She was just interested in doing the job right. Jenna Ruiz became her right hand, unofficially at first, and then officially when Marks created a new role for surgical coordinators who could bridge the gap between nursing and physician teams. It was the kind of structural change that most administrators talked about but never implemented. Marks just did it, and it worked. General Harding stayed in touch. He sent her a handwritten letter a month after the ceremony, thanking her again and telling her that Corporal Dennison was back on active duty, healthy and grateful. He also told her that if she ever wanted to return to military medicine, there would be a place for her. She wrote back and thanked him, but said she was exactly where she needed to be. The story didn't end with a parade or a movie deal or a viral video. It ended the way most real stories of integrity end. Quietly. With a woman who had done the right thing over and over, finally being seen for who she was. And with a community that had learned the hard way that sometimes the person you underestimate is the person who will save your life. Pause. So what's the lesson here? What's the thing we're supposed to take away from a story like this? Maybe it's this. Competence doesn't need to announce itself. Real skill doesn't need a spotlight. The people who are truly exceptional are often the ones who do the work without asking for credit, who show up when no one is watching, and who carry their past quietly because they know their actions will speak louder than their resume ever could. Dr. Alina Marks could have walked into St. Augustine on day one and told everyone she was a combat veteran. She could have demanded respect. She could have used her background as leverage, but she didn't, because she understood something that a lot of people never learn. Your value isn't determined by how loudly you proclaim it. It's determined by what you do when the stakes are highest and no one is keeping score. And in the end, that's what General Harding recognized, not just her skill. Not just her experience, but her character. The kind of character that saves lives not because it will be rewarded, but because it's the right thing to do. Pause. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the people in your own life who do the work without asking for applause, Leave a comment. Tell me about someone who deserves recognition. Tell me about a time you saw competence go unnoticed. And if you want more stories like this, stories that remind us what integrity looks like when it's tested, make sure you're subscribed. We're just getting started. There's a postscript to this story. About 6 months after everything happened, Dr. Marks was sitting in her office late one evening reviewing surgical schedules when there was a knock on the door. She looked up. It was a young woman, maybe mid-20s, wearing a Marine Corps uniform, her cover tucked under her arm. "Dr. Marks?" the woman said. Marks stood. "Yes." The woman stepped inside and closed the door. "My name is Lance Corporal Ava Dennison. You saved my dad." There was a long pause. Marks felt something tighten in her chest. "Corporal Dennison is your father," Ava nodded. "He talks about you all the time. He tells everyone. He says you're the reason I still have a dad." Marks didn't know what to say. Ava reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. "He wanted me to give you this. He's not great with words, but he wanted you to know." Marks unfolded the paper. It was a letter written in careful handwriting. It was short. Just a few lines, but it said everything. "Dr. Marks, you gave me my life back. You gave my daughter her father. You gave my wife her husband. I don't know how to thank you for that except to live the kind of life that honors what you did. I'll never forget it. And neither will she. Semper Fi, Corporal James Denny." "Son." Marks folded the letter carefully and set it on her desk. She looked at Ava, who was standing at attention, her eyes bright. "Thank you," Marks said quietly. "Tell your father I'm glad he's doing well." Ava nodded, and then, just like Harding had done months before, she saluted. Marks returned the salute, and when the young Marine left, Marks sat down at her desk, looked at the letter, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel what she so rarely let herself feel: pride. Not in the recognition, not in the title, but in the work, in the lives saved, in the quiet knowledge that she had done what she was trained to do and that it had mattered. Pause. That's the end of the story. But maybe it's not really an ending. Maybe it's just a reminder that every day in hospitals and firehouses and schools and 1,000 other places, there are people like Dr. Alina Marks doing the work that holds the world together. People who don't need applause, people who show up, people who know their value and don't need you to validate it. And maybe, if we're lucky, we'll be paying attention when one of them walks into the room. So the next time you see someone who's quiet, who doesn't perform confidence, who just does the work, don't underestimate them, because they might be the person who saves your life, or someone you love. And when that moment comes, you'll be grateful they were there. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. Seriously. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, remember, competence doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs a chance.